do you have questions about what we saw last time? Again, your modesty is again excessive, yet you do not dare to come out. If the questions come into your mind, you interrupt me. Could you tell me where we stopped? I think we were talking about the year 1936. We had spoken about the occupation of the demilitarized Rhineland and the consequences. We had spoken about Spanish Civil War, the Olympic Games, and the Anti-Comintern Pact. I think we had finished the tour of this year, so we proceed then to the year 1937. Now you see, sometimes in history, events seem, or let's say sometimes years seem to be colorless, as if nothing had happened. And even outside in great international events, nothing spectacular, at least at first sight, happened in 1937. But still, the view we have on history changes when new information comes and when new balances in terms of overall universal interest come about. And that is certainly true for the year 1937, because there are two events which in those days did not, one was totally ignored because it was a secret meeting. The other one was an event taking place in Asia, and Asia was, and in the Far East was considered, it's that far away. Well, with our Western and particularly European prejudices, we consider this as of minor importance. In reality, it was very important. And I'll speak first about, that is the beginning of World War II for China and Japan. Because in those days, nobody would even have dared or would have had the idea to speak about the beginning of World War II. But on the date, and I will allow me to show you a trick where you can easily remember a date, on the 7th of July, 1937. So this is a date you will never forget. 3 times 7. 7th of July, 1937, Japan started attacking China. And on this day, the Japanese provoked an incident, a military incident which they staged. It was a so-called incident or the clash on the Marco Polo Bridge. The Marco Polo Bridge is a bridge in the neighborhood of Beijing, because the Japanese had, after their invasion of Manchuria, that is of the northeastern provinces of China, they did continuously extend their expansion, and they had come practically into the neighborhood of Beijing. Now, on the 7th of July, 1937, they staged a clash. They were responsible for it. And they did take this clash, this incident, as a pretext to attack now, to launch a vast attack against China. Now, not only now in the Beijing area, but all along the coast, from north to south, the Japanese started invading the Chinese mainland. And it was considered as a war between two neighbors. In reality, it was what we have to consider the beginning of World War II, even though there were neither the United States nor other European countries nor the Soviet Union was involved. But it ultimately turned out that the two countries, China and Japan, were fighting what we consider World War II for 8 years. For more than 8 years even, from July 1937 until August 1945 for the two countries. And for the Chinese, it was even in that sense more, I would say, dramatic, because what did precede this World War II was a civil war which was fought between the communists and the nationalists in China, which ceased momentarily when the Japanese aggression came. But what was also tragic for the Chinese people and for China was that when World War II was over in 1945, the civil war between communists and nationalists flared up again, so that China faced, you could say, China faced practically a war situation, international and civil. The civil war was, let's say, at its worst already from 1933-34 on, when Mao started the Long March. And it lasted until Mao's victory in 1949. So you must imagine that here was a country and a population which was exposed to a war situation. And this war situation was absolutely cruel and dramatic for 15 years. You can imagine what kind of a pressure, what kind of a suffering this meant for the populations. Now, and that is why I insist so much that the 7th of July 1937 was the beginning of this war. Now, before I'll say more about it, I cannot resist not the temptation, but the opportunity to insist that as far as the attitude of the Japanese army in China, and not only in China, also in other parts of Asia are concerned, until this day, the present Japanese government, as the preceding ones, they have not made a clear slate about what really happened. Because the worst atrocities were committed by the Japanese armies, atrocities which were in no way less than what the SS and what the German army did in Eastern Europe. And there is particularly one incident, and I have already mentioned it, that was December 1937. That was has entered in history under the name of the rape of Nanking, when the Japanese army occupied Nanking, which was at that time it is a big city located, I would say, about at the middle on the coast, and the nationalist government had withdrawn. As the Japanese had occupied Beijing, they had withdrawn to Nanking, which was their provisional capital, before they did withdraw towards the interior. When the Japanese army did take Nanking, they massacred tens of thousands of Chinese troops, of Chinese soldiers which had surrendered. And these were absolutely wanton massacres, war crimes. They raped tens of thousands of Chinese girls and women, and very often killed them afterwards. It was absolutely incredible. And there are very solid reports about, from missionaries, from diplomats, from consular agents who reported this. There was even a German Nazi businessman by the name of Rabe, who a movie has now been made because he was referred to as the German, a new version of Schindler in China, who tried to protect and who did save hundreds of particularly women and girls from the worst, let's say, conduct on the part of the Japanese during this, not days, but weeks and months, that these savage, let's say, behaviors did take place in this city. Now I close this digression, but I'll come back to the event itself. So the war a word about this war. The Japanese tried to conquer China, but of course the prey, if I may say, called the Chinese or China prey, was too big for the means the Japanese had. They were not strong enough to conquer all of China occupied, but on the other hand, the Chinese nationalists, even though Stalin forced the communist Mao to make a truce with the nationalists, but the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek, he was the head of the Chinese government, of the Chinese nationalists. They were not strong enough to stop the Japanese or to kick them out. So in other words, a kind of stalemate situation occurred On the one side, the Japanese were unable to conquer the last capital and the territory which Chiang Kai-shek had withdrawn to. That was the southwestern part of China. It is an area, it's called the Sichuan. It is the interior and the capital, the city. It's now a million population, big city by the name of Chongqing. Chiang Kai-shek did withdraw to this area. That was the southwestern part of China, and Mao had withdrawn towards the northwestern part after the long march, and he also did resist the Japanese. So the Japanese were unable to conquer, but neither the communists nor the nationalists, nor both together, were strong enough to kick them out. And this meant that for 8 years practically the situation was a kind of a stalemate situation, that the Japanese would not admit that they were not capable of conquering all of China, and on the other hand, the Chinese the nationalists got support from later on from the United States, and the communists, of course, in as much as Stalin could send supply, he would. But nonetheless, the situation was such that when we look over the event, which we call, in a general perspective, World War II, it started in July 1937 for China and for Japan. And in that regard, it was important. Now, what does interest us is essentially the following. And for Hitler, it was a kind of delicate situation. Because in the first place, the nationalist, Chiang Kai-shek, had used German support before Hitler came to power. The Weimar Republic the German army was sending military advisors to Chiang Kai-shek to give him, to counsel him in his fight against Mao. But when Hitler now became an associate of Japan, that is when he signed, remember, the year before, in 1936, the anti-Comintern Pact, he could not at the same time keep military advisors on the side of the nationalists and have an alliance with Japan. So he ended then this support to the nationalists and played fully the Japanese card. So in that regard, he switched sides in this situation. But the Germans did not commit themselves deeply to what was going on, neither the Weimar Republic nor Hitler, to what was going on in China, because that was considered that far away and not that important for the national interest of Germany. But still, we should not forget it, and particularly seeing now how important those countries are now, not only in the Far East, but I would say worldwide. China and Japan, both of them, for different reasons. The second event now, about which I'll have to say a word, is a secret meeting, which did take place in November 1937. It might have been November 5th or November, I think it was November 5th, 1937. This secret meeting was a meeting which Hitler had organized with his close advisors in Berchtesgaden. Berchtesgaden is Hitler's alpine mountain retreat south of Munich. He invited his close advisors, that is military and also political, to tell them what his plans were. Now, this meeting passed unnoticed by the outside world and became known only after World War II, because it was a secret meeting. But it was when Germany had lost the war and when the archives were captured by the Allies. So a document was discovered, and this document was a memorandum which one of the participants at this meeting had written after the meeting. And the man who had written this memorandum was a colonel who had accompanied the general, a general who was the head of the German army. And this colonel's name was Hossbach. Hossbach did write down what Hitler had said and how this meeting did take place. Now, those who participated in this meeting, I will put the names of these individuals because they are important. So, first, the Minister of Defense. Now, let me first write out the names and then I'll talk again to you. These 5 individuals which did participate, I'll say a word about. Blomberg was a general. General Blomberg was Minister of Defense. And he was one of the, he was a national conservative. But he had entered the Hitler government at the time when the coalition was set up. The second man, Fritsch, is also a general. And he was head of the army, one of the Army, Navy, Air Force. So Fritsch was the head of the army. The third one, Raeder, was an admiral, head of the Navy. The fourth one, you know, Goering. Goering participated in his capacity as head of the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and also as minister responsible for the 4 years plan. You know that Hitler always, with one eye he was looking towards Stalin and what the Soviet Union was doing, with another eye he wanted to differentiate himself. Stalin had introduced from 1928 on, this is a parenthesis of course, a system of 5 years plans. 5 years plans to implement what was later on called the Stalin Revolution. So Hitler, of course, he would not call, 6 years would not have made sense. So he picked then 4 years. That was Goering. And the last one, Neurath, he was Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was one of those who had advised Hitler in 1936, at the beginning of 1936, not to send the German army in the demilitarized Rhinelands. So these were the 5 closest advisors of Hitler. 3 generals, or let's say 3 men from the armed forces, Goering, the Luftwaffe, but Goering was of course Hitler's second in command, and then Neurath. Hossbach did accompany Fritsch. Hossbach was the aide de camp. What is the English word for aide de camp? Do you have the same? He was the secretary of this general. He accompanied the general and did take notes. And so his memorandum was found after 1945, so we know about this meeting. Now, in this meeting, Hitler was practically repeating, but this time, with greater precision, of what he had written in Mein Kampf, that is, about his foreign policy. In other words, what was at stake was the conquest of living space. But now we are in the year 1937, we are close now, where this whole plan had to be implemented. So Hitler would openly speak about what he had in mind of doing in the foreseeable future. So first of all, he told the generals that he had made preparations also in terms of rearmament, that war would have to come, that there would be war. Conquest of living space meant war. And Hitler said clearly that this could come already next year, 1938. Or, he said, the latest, 1943. 1938, because he will start now gambling in terms of foreign policy. That is why we enter now, after 1937, a totally new time period. Why did he say he could not wait beyond 1943? Because, he said, by 1943, his enemies, those who against whom he would have to fight, or those who would resist him, they would have caught up with the German rearmament. He felt that he had an advance at the time, from 1937-38 on, because from 1933 on, he was on a massive scale, first secretly and then openly rearming. But his potential enemies would catch up with the German rearmament by 1943. So in other words, the war would come between these two dates, between 38 and 43. That was one reason. The second reason why he said the war had to come during this time period was, he said that he was growing older and that he might be exposed to an assassination attempt. And he considered that he alone was practically selected by Providence, whatever he understood by this, to conduct Germany at the time of the conquest of living space. And that in order to avoid an accident that he might die, he would have to do it relatively early during this time period. Now, this being said, so far about the beginning, what were now his direct plans? I do not repeat because, well, he did, of course. He spoke for hours, and everybody had to listen religiously, not to interrupt him. So he analyzed the situation of England, France, Italy. I don't repeat it's the same what he said in Mein Kampf. But then he started becoming very precise. His first target was Czechoslovakia. He considered that Czechoslovakia was a creation by the French on the German flank in order to weaken Germany. He would sometimes even use, let's say, comparisons as if this were a kind of continental Air Force carrier, just meant to keep Germany down. And therefore, he stated very clearly that his aim, as far as Czechoslovakia was concerned, was it had to be destroyed. And of course, this could only be done through military action. The second target would be Austria, which would be annexed. Here, he considered that this would become no problem. That was a political issue because the Austrians would not resist. And the third target would be Poland. That Poland would have to agree on border corrections. That is, those territories which Poland had occupied after World War I, which, for instance, separated the bulk of the German mainland from the Eastern German territories, that Poland would have to agree to allow Germany to recover those territories which separated East from West. When he had finished, 3 of the 5 present objected to this, particularly in as far as his plans for the attack against Czechoslovakia were concerned. Those who had reservations, or those who showed that they did not agree, that they did not find that this was a good idea, were Blomberg, the Minister of Defense, the head of the army, Fritsch, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Neurath. You could say, in a sense, it were the same individuals who had already, a year earlier, in March 1936, who had warned Hitler about the danger of entering the demilitarized Rhinelands. And their argument was, in this case, the same. These 3 close advisors of Hitler, their argument was that the French would certainly not accept this, that Germany would attack Czechoslovakia and destroy the Czech state. That this would mean, in all probability, a war on 2 fronts. That is, the Czechs on one side, and nobody knew how the Soviet Union would react, and on the other side, the French and the British would certainly not accept it. When they dared to say this, Hitler flew into a rage. Hitler became extremely furious. He exploded, really, and shouted them down. And when the meeting was over, everybody left, and the consequences which came out of this meeting, the consequences for the internal evolution of Germany, will be very interesting, because the three individuals will be removed from their positions. Hitler could not stand any longer the slightest criticisms. He did take it at face value that he was always right. Der Führer hat immer recht. The Führer is always right. Now, interesting is how he got rid of these three individuals, because the three had, I would say, a different weight, a different influence inside the Germany and even inside Nazi Germany. First, the generals first, Blomberg and Fritsch. He could not simply decide, even though he had the power, theoretically, to dismiss Blomberg and to dismiss Fritsch, because the two generals had a certain popularity amongst the German officers. So in other words, this might have consequences if he removed them simply like that. So he had to find a way so that by removing them, he had an excuse. There was a reason to remove them, and he, of course, could not say the real reason, because he objected to what he had in mind of doing. So Blomberg first. Now, this is typical Nazi, and this is typical, I would say, the lowest moral level, how you can try to get rid of somebody. And here the SS played a role. Not only the SS, but also Göring. Göring and Himmler and Heydrich, they now set up a trap for Blomberg. And the trap was already, or at least worked very quickly. Blomberg was a widower. He had lost his wife some time before, and so he met a relatively younger lady. He fell in love with this woman, but of course what he did not know was that this woman, as we say, had a past. In other words, that she had practiced a certain profession which was not considered as the most moral or the most honest profession. But of course, he did not know about it, but the police knew about it, and Göring knew about it. So what happened, they let him marry this woman. And Hitler even attended. We could assume as a witness, as a marriage witness. It is not clear whether Hitler already at that time knew about it. But once the young couple, if we may call them young, he was in his maybe late 50s or early 60s, and she was maybe in her 30s. When they went for their holidays to Italy for their honeymoon, they were called back because Göring and Himmler, they went to see Hitler and said, look, what kind of a woman did General Blomberg marry? When Hitler saw this, he was furious. This was a dishonor for the German army. So Blomberg was recalled from his honeymoon and was told that this kind of a disgrace, that the top German officer had married a prostitute, that was absolutely unacceptable. So he was practically advised to resign because of his misdemeanor, the way he had behaved. And so he resigned. And Göring hoped that Göring was always out for getting jobs. He was collecting high positions like others would collect stamps. But in this case, he had underrated Hitler's Machiavellian ideas, because Hitler did not want to let somebody else take over Blomberg's position. So what Hitler did, instead of replacing Blomberg by another general who would be in a top position as Minister of Defense, he did take over this job. But of course, he would not call himself Minister of Defense. So he transformed the Ministry of Defense in the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. In German, OKW. OKW means Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. And he would take over this position, Hitler, personally. So in other words, he did take advantage of the elimination of Blomberg to get even a more direct grip over the German armed forces. He was now the equivalent of what Blomberg had been before Minister of Defense.
Wouldn't he still have had to have delegated things to aides, even though he put himself in position?
He did delegate this to a general who, but this general would only replace him when he was not there. But he would, in the future, he would more than once be present personally with having this general close to him. That was General Keitel. He's one of those who will be condemned to death at the Nuremberg war crime trials. Keitel was his representative. But he was nonetheless Keitel even became, we'll see more about this evolution of the armed forces later on, because he will even increase his control. As you raised the question, in 1941, when the attack against the Soviet Union in December failed, ultimately, he would sack the commanding generals and take over then the command of the army. Not Navy and Air Force. And that will be the OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, the army. And here, Keitel replaced him. Anyway, these are technicalities, but he was now the direct responsible for giving orders to the three arms: Army, Navy, Air Force. That was one move. What about Fritsch? Fritsch had objected. Fritsch had been very outspoken in saying, that Fritsch said that the rearmament was not sufficient, that the German army did not have sufficient reserves for being ready for a drawn-out long war. So Fritsch had also to go. But for Fritsch it was more difficult, because Fritsch was not in the same position than Blomberg. And so here the SS, the Gestapo, and Himmler and Heydrich, they went even further down, to even a lower ground, to frame Fritsch. Because Fritsch was called in for a meeting with Hitler. And when he was brought in, Hitler had with him another officer of the rank of a captain whose name was Frisch. Frisch, in other words, you write it the same way except no T. Frisch. And Fritsch was confronted with this officer who had just before been tortured by the Gestapo, so that he would admit having had homosexual relations with Fritsch. So in other words, they tried to frame Fritsch for homosexual relations with another officer. But it was not even an officer, it was an individual by the name of Frisch. And when he was confronted in Hitler's office with this accusation, Fritsch was so outraged, as this was untrue. He had no such relations. But the fact that the Führer dared to face him with an individual who had been, of course he did not know that he had been tortured, who accused him before Hitler that he was his homosexual partner, he, in disgust, resigned. He was so outraged that he resigned from his position, and that was a trick. They wanted him to resign by his own decision.
Why didn't he point out to Hitler that even if it had been true, he was okay with Rome being the homosexual?
The Rome was long gone, and they probably wanted to provoke him in this kind of protest reaction, because it wasn't true. The man had been the other one had been tortured. So Fritsch resigned in protest, and he was then replaced, and I'm not putting up this name, even though you can check it, by a general who had a young Nazi wife, and who was a yes-sayer, who would never dare to say the contrary of what Hitler said. That was General Brauchitsch. So in other words, Hitler had now a head of the army who was absolutely complacent, who would always obey. Brauchitsch. That was not all. Neurath, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Neurath, just one more word about General Fritsch. General Fritsch had as chief of staff a general by the name of Beck. General Beck resigned at the same time, also in protest against what was done to his commander. And this General Beck will be a key figure in the conspiracies which ultimately will take place in the German army against Hitler. So in other words, among the German generals, there were a number of individuals who disagreed with Hitler, and here Beck was outraged because he knew that the accusations against Fritsch were made up, and there were other generals who also disagreed. But Beck he was the former chief of staff of Fritsch, will be one of the key figures later on in the conspiracy of the military against Hitler. Now Neurath, the third man. Neurath was a survivor of the Papen cabinet, the Hitler Papen cabinet, but Neurath had no serious following neither among the army nor he could be dismissed without problems. So he was dismissed and replaced by the man who had already negotiated the year before the anti-Comintern pact, that is Joachim von Ribbentrop, which you have in Fest, Ribbentrop. So Ribbentrop, he was 100% Nazi. And so he replaced Neurath. Now, what is important, these events did take place in December, January, that is, in the weeks and months following the meeting between Hitler and his advisors. So by January 1938, Hitler was surrounded now in his close environment by only individuals who would always agree, who would never dare to disagree. Because Goering, of course, would always agree, and Raeder was also an admiral who never opposed Hitler. So in other words, Blomberg gone, Hitler's close advisors would be yes-sayers. And they sometimes even, particularly that was the case for Ribbentrop. I hope that you will not only study in Fast those personalities which are on the agenda for the final test, but that you would also read briefly or rapidly what is written about the others. Now, Ribbentrop, who was later on also condemned to death and executed, Ribbentrop would even exaggerate his subservience, his docility towards Hitler. Ribbentrop, like Hans Frank, the one who will be governor of Poland after Poland was invaded, they tried to imagine what Hitler thought. So they would, even before Hitler would utter his ideas or his orders, they would already come out with saying, well, we think that this would be a good idea. The Germans call this Vorauseilender Gehorsam, that is preventive obedience. Before even they would know what was expected from them, they would come up with, in other words, their subservience, their subordination under Hitler was total, more than total. Now, from January 1938 on, Hitler could now take the initiative, and he will. Now, but that is not the only event. We had the Japanese attack against China. Hitler will take this also as a precedent when he attacked Poland. We will see that maybe not today, but certainly next time. Then this meeting with his close advisors. There is a third event which we will just mention to complete it. That is Italy. In late 1937, Italy joined the Anti-Comintern Pact, which had been signed the year before between Japan and Germany. So now Mussolini joining now this kind of special agreement, the Anti-Comintern Pact, this meant that even outwardly, before the rest of the world, the three dictatorial aggressive powers, Nazi Germany, imperialist Japan, and fascist Italy, they now proclaimed their alliance. And this was, of course, a remarkable contrast, what I already said last time, when you compared the attitude of the democracies. Because the democracies, the United States were still in their full isolation, the British and the French, they were in a position of weakness, and they had no formal alliance. So in other words, the dictators had practically a free hand from 1938 on, and even before. And so we enter now the next phase, the last phase before the war, 1938, 1939, that is Hitler's territorial annexation or territorial violations of the Versailles Peace Treaty, or in other words, Hitler's preliminaries before the conquest of living space. When we say Hitler's preliminaries, we mean the three countries he had singled out to deal with them. That is Czechoslovakia first, Austria, and then afterwards Poland. So again, the same as we did for the preceding events, we will take now one event after the other. First, the year 1938. In the year 1938, two events dominated. Each event was of great political importance. The first event was the annexation of Austria, March 1938. The second event will be the Munich Conference, September 28th, 29th, 1938. And it had to do, of course, with Czechoslovakia. So in other words, we turn first towards the annexation of Austria. Now this is very often known in history books with the Nazi name of annexation. The Nazis formulated a special word, Anschluss. Anschluss is a stronger word even than annexation. Now again, when we examine now these two events, and then afterwards we'll examine the events of 1939, which ultimately will lead to the war, we proceed with our triple approach: origins, events, consequences, as we have already done it for the Rhineland occupation and for the Spanish Civil War. So origins first. Now, Hitler had in mind that Austria, that is his homeland, would join Germany, would join the Greater German Reich, would be annexed to Germany. But nonetheless, this is that was not his first, that was on the blueprint he had, that was not his first target. His first target had been Czechoslovakia. The question is now, why did Austria come first? Now, as I just said, there was no doubt that he wanted Austria to join. Now, why did Austria come first? This had to do not with his own decision, but with, let's say, an event which he had not foreseen, which made him change the sequence of his territorial violations. And this had to do with the Austrian Chancellor. Now, the Austrian Chancellor in 1934, remember, had been assassinated during an attempt by the Austrian Nazis to take power. And this assassination was the bloodiest aspect of this failed Nazi attempt. Now, who was the chancellor who was killed by the Nazis? The history majors. Where are your passive memories? Or your active memories? Because it's not that long ago. Who was it? Now, who has found now in his... Dollfuss, yes. Dollfuss was a chancellor who in July 1934 was assassinated. Now we come to Dollfuss' successor. And the name of this successor is nearly as complicated as the name of Hitler's grandmother before her illegitimate child was recognized as Hitler. Do you remember the name of Hitler's grandmother? Schicklgruber. Yes, Schicklgruber. Now, rather complicated. The Austrian names are sometimes complicated. The successor of Dollfuss was Schuschnigg. Schuschnigg was Austrian chancellor after the death of Dollfuss. Now, you should know that Dollfuss, the same as his successor, they were chancellors, but in reality they were dictators. Because Austria was not a democracy. It was a conservative dictatorship, and it was, in a sense, let's say, Mussolini's junior partner. Italian influence had been very great. Remember that Mussolini, after the Dollfuss assassination, he had sent 5 Italian divisions to the Brenner Pass. That was in 1934. But now we are in 1938. And meanwhile, Mussolini's attitude towards Hitler had totally changed. We have seen that. It had changed from late 1935 on, that is Mussolini's attack against Ethiopia. It had changed also as a consequence of the Spanish Civil War. Ultimately, the two dictators had become very close friends and allies and partners. So in other words, the Austrians, and Schuschnigg knew about this, the Austrians could not now rely on an automatic protection by the Italians in their dealings with Hitler. And even Mussolini had told the Austrian chancellor that he should try to make a deal with Hitler. He should try to get along with Hitler. And that is precisely what Schuschnigg wanted. So Schuschnigg approached the Nazi ambassador to Vienna and demanded that the Nazi ambassador to Vienna should arrange a meeting between him and Hitler. I have an indiscreet question now. Who was the Nazi ambassador to Vienna? We all know him. You too. Who was it? Aha. I caught you now. You were supposed to prepare this for your midterm test. Who was the Nazi ambassador to Vienna? Who? Goebbels. No, don't make guesses now. We are not at an auction. Who bids more? Who was it? It was one of the 4 you had to prepare. It can't be true.
Was he the one
I
that
wonder what
assassinated?
kind of sins I committed in my past lives that God is punishing me
Was he
with
the
this
one-
kind of an.
Was he already part of the government before Hitler?
Was he assassinated? Was he the one that
He was one of the four you had to prepare. Yes, Papen. It can't be true. Papen was Nazi ambassador to Vienna, and Papen went to Hitler and said, Schuschnigg wants to see you. And Hitler said, okay, I will see him in Berchtesgaden. In early March, the meeting was arranged in February, so early March, the two met in Berchtesgaden. That is why Hitler now changed the scenario. He will take Austria first now, whereas he had originally intended to deal first with Czechoslovakia. So Schuschnigg went to see Hitler in Berchtesgaden. And what did he want to talk to Hitler about? Essentially, for one reason, that Schuschnigg had noticed that the Austrian Nazis were again conspiring against him. In other words, that the Austrian Nazis were making plans to make a more successful attempt to seize power against Schuschnigg. And Schuschnigg thought he would go and see Hitler, complain to Hitler about this, and request from Hitler that he should tell his Austrian Nazis to keep quiet and to respect the Austrian government. That is what Schuschnigg, in his naivety, had imagined when he went to see Hitler. Now, so far for the origins, which did trigger off now the events. What will be now the events? The first event, Schuschnigg meets Hitler in Berchtesgaden. But this meeting, the meeting turned out absolutely differently from what Schuschnigg had imagined. Because when Schuschnigg enters Hitler's office, he barely had opened his mouth that Hitler started shouting at him, accusing him for being a traitor to the cause of Germany, for totally disregarding German influence, the attitude of the Austrian Nazis, and he started intimidating Schuschnigg to such a degree. Instead of listening to what the Austrian Chancellor said, Hitler requested from him that he should declare an absolute amnesty for the crime which had been committed in 1934. And those who were still in jail, he requested that these Nazis should be liberated. And in addition, he requested from Schuschnigg that he should appoint as Minister of the Interior a man who was well known as being a Nazi fellow traveler, if not to say a Nazi. And this man, the name is a little bit complicated, I admit, the same as Schuschnigg's, but I'm afraid that I will have to mention him because he will play a role now. And that was Seyss Inquart. Seyss Inquart. Seyss-Inquart. Seyss Inquart was a well-known sympathizer of National Socialism in Austria, and Hitler requested from Schuschnigg that he should appoint him as Minister of the Interior. Now, while this meeting did take place, an interruption occurred at a given moment. Schuschnigg was requested to withdraw momentarily. Then the German officers passed by, the highest German generals, to see Hitler briefly. They passed back, and Hitler then told Schuschnigg if he would not comply to this request, then Hitler would simply send the German army in, occupy Austria. So in other words, it was not just, let's say, verbal shouting and intimidation. There was also the threat that if he would not implement what Hitler requested him to do, then the invasion would take place. And so Schuschnigg was dismissed after a meeting where he did not imagine what he was coming in for when he had demanded from Papen that he should arrange the meeting. So he went back to Vienna in total despair. Yes.
He liberated the Nazis in jail, and then he appointed the Minister of the Interior. But what did he declare?
Hitler requested him that he should nominate Seyss-Inquart Minister of the Interior. But this is your question now brings me up to ask a question to you. Why do you think did he request that the Nazis should become Minister of the Interior?
So they can control the army, right?
Not the army,
Police.
the police. Yes. It was the same trick as when he, as Chancellor, was appointed and the Minister of the Interior was Frick for all of Germany and Göring for Prussia. In other words, he wanted to have a key man in a strategic position in order to carry out what he had in mind, that is the annexation. So Schuschnigg went back to Vienna in total despair. He did not want, he didn't know what to do because he had absolutely no foreign support. Mussolini had told him to make an arrangement with Hitler. The French and the British did not like him because he was a dictator who disregarded the working of democracy in Austria. And of course, Stalin had nothing to do with the man who was crushing the communists. So in other words, he was on his own. He tried now to find a way out of this impasse. He thought the only way that was left to avoid an annexation, an open annexation of Austria by the Nazis, was to call on the Austrian people. In other words, he went back, and once he was back in Vienna, he addressed then the Austrian people, announcing to them that for the weekend, which would follow, that they would have to decide by a referendum whether they wanted to stay independent or whether they wanted to join Germany. In other words, he tried to avoid this fatal evolution towards annexation by calling openly on the Austrian people to let them. That was not because he all of a sudden had abandoned his dictatorial ideas. He thought it was the last way to avoid this deadly embrace by Hitler. Because, first of all, he expected that maybe, it was not sure, a majority would decide to stay independent. And secondly, if that would happen, that Hitler could not then disregard this and order the invasion of Austria. So in other words, he thought that this was the only way to save Austrian independence. But of course, he had made this calculation without Hitler's reaction. Because when Hitler saw this, that Schuschnigg did not he had appointed, of course, meanwhile, Seyss-Inquart, but that Schuschnigg tried to avoid the annexation, Hitler then showed his true hand. Hitler requested Göring to get on the phone and call Schuschnigg in Vienna. First request by Göring, and it was always accompanied by a threat that if he would not comply, the German army would move in at once. Göring requested from Schuschnigg that he would abandon the referendum, that he would call off the referendum. If not, the German army would invade. And Schuschnigg, of course, under this kind of a pressure, under this kind of a blackmail, gave in. He did call off the referendum, but that was not the end. Second call by Göring. Goering requested him, on Hitler's demand of course, to step down, to resign as Chancellor, and have Seyss-Inquart take his position. In other words, that Schuschnigg would have to resign and let the Nazi, the Minister of the Interior, take over the position as Chancellor. This time, Schuschnigg was ready to resign because he saw no chance, but it was this time the Austrian president, because Schuschnigg was head of government, but Austria had, as head of state, a president. Now, the president refused for several hours because he had to accept Schuschnigg's resignation, and he had also to appoint Seyss-Inquart. Now, after several hours of hesitation and expectation, ultimately the president accepted Schuschnigg's resignation and nominated Seyss-Inquart Chancellor. That was not the end of it. Next phone call, this time to Seyss-Inquart. Seyss-Inquart was told that he should request by telegram that the German army should enter Austria in order to ensure security and order inside the country. So Seyss-Inquart, maybe he might have imagined several minutes that he was now Chancellor. He will not remain Chancellor for a long time. The German army already before Seyss-Inquart sent his telegram as requested to Berlin. The German army had already invaded Austria. So the German army would move in and occupy all of Austria. And Hitler would accompany, he would follow in a car the advancing German troops, and while on his way to Vienna, he stopped in Linz. What was so peculiar with Linz? That was his hometown. He was not born in Linz, he was born in Braunau, but he had his childhood in Linz. So he stopped in Linz, and he was at that time so overwhelmed that before even waiting, in Linz he proclaimed the annexation of Austria by Germany, and at the same time announced that the Austrian people and that the German people would be requested to vote, in a vote, approve or disapprove this annexation. And then he went further to Vienna. But even before he arrived in Vienna, Himmler and Heydrich had already sent their advanced Gestapo men in Vienna, who had already started rounding up the Jewish, let's say the leading Jewish people and also other political opponents of Nazi Germany in Vienna. And they would immediately set up in the neighborhood of Linz a concentration camp, as they had done it in Germany, and this concentration camp will be the camp of Mauthausen. Now, what was now the reaction of the other countries against this territorial coup, the annexation of Austria? First of all, Hitler had sent a special envoy, even a prince, who had Nazi sympathies. He had sent this prince to Mussolini to request from Mussolini. It was just, a formal, he didn't mean it seriously. It was just a formal operation that Mussolini should agree to let Hitler have Austria, and this prince ensured Mussolini that Hitler would not have territorial requests upon Italy on behalf of Austria. Now, what did this mean? This meant that after World War I, Italy did annex a territory which had belonged to Austria, which was the so-called South Tyrol. That is an area which was inhabited by a population which spoke German. the South Tyrol. And Hitler told Mussolini that he wouldn't have to fear that Hitler would request that Mussolini would turn this territory back to Austria, that is to Germany. Mussolini allowed Hitler to take the bite, to swallow the prey. And Hitler then said publicly that he would never forget this. And for once he did stick to what he promised, that he would always remain Mussolini's friend and would always be there. And Mussolini would be surprised later on that this friendship would not only bring him sorrows and trouble, but also would save him later, at least temporarily. So in other words, Mussolini said yes. And this was important because Austria had been, until that time, had been a satellite of Mussolini. What was the attitude now of France and of England? France happened at the time when Hitler made this coup. France was without a majority government. The French government had resigned. So in other words, France had a caretaker government, as we would say. And so this caretaker government, the same as the British government, they protested. They protested against this violation of the Versailles Peace Treaty. And by the way, this was also a violation of the Stresa Front, because remember, at the Stresa Front, Mussolini and the two Western democracies had committed themselves to preserve the territorial integrity of Austria. Yes, you have a question.
Yeah, I was wondering if Hitler purposely invaded at this date because they didn't have a full government at the time? No.
Hitler didn't care. Even if they had had a government, he would have done it anyway. So in other words, the democracy's reaction were protest, diplomatic protest against this violation, and that was it. Now, so far for the events. Between the meeting in Berchtesgaden between Schuschnigg and Hitler, and the invasion and the attitude of the neighbor Stalin, of course, he was far away. Stalin had no say in all this. The consequences. Which were the consequences now? They were very important. First of all, this was the first territorial violation, where Hitler invaded a territory outside Germany. It was the beginning of the implementation of the conquest of living. It was the beginning of the preliminaries. It was not the first preliminary as mentioned in Mein Kampf and as also mentioned in this meeting with his advisors, but nonetheless, it was a territorial violation and he got away with it. So in other words, Hitler was convinced that the Western democracies were totally decadent, cowards, and that they would let him continue, that he could continue. In other words, he was encouraged to go ahead with his plan to implement the other preliminaries. Secondly, now Hitler had a common frontier with Italy, because Hitler had been separated, Germany had been separated from Italy by Austria. Now that Austria became a German province, a German territory, there was now a direct frontier. In other words, the two dictators could now directly communicate. Not only they could come and visit one another, but they also could exchange supplies, information, communication. In other words, this was a strengthening of this axis Rome-Berlin. Austria was at that time a country which had a population of approximately 6.5 million inhabitants. Now, these 6.5 million inhabitants meant that the German army would have 500,000 more of a reservoir of soldiers, and that the German army could also take advantage of a number, they were not very numerous, of a number of industries which Austria had. and which would reinforce, of course, the potential. Austria had a Jewish population, which was more numerous than the German Jewish population. And Austria had it, in other words, there were about 180,000 Jews living in Austria. And quite a few of them had avoided this, had gone abroad. Some had gone to Czechoslovakia, some others had gone elsewhere. Sigmund Freud will emigrate ultimately to England, to London. To go over from Vienna, he will go to London to die there. Others were arrested by the Gestapo, who arrived quickly and to round up all these leading Jewish people. I told you about the concentration camp. And others committed suicide. They did not want to leave Austria, and on the other hand, they did not want to fall into Nazi hands. So it was very dramatic.
Had the German Jews already been arrested at this point?
Already a number of, Germany had a Jewish population of, roughly speaking, 500,000 for 65 or 66 million inhabitants. Of this 500,000, by waves, some left right away when Hitler came to power. Others will see that when we speak about the road to the final solution. But now, let's say, in terms of proportion, 500,000 out of 66 million, that is less than 180,000 out of 6 million. So far for the Jewish population, but that's not all. Austria became a German province. But what you should nonetheless not overlook is that in Austria, anti-Semitism was at least as strongly implanted as in Germany. In Austria were some fierce anti-Semites. That is why some of the concentration and extermination camp commanders and also some of the leading SS came from Austria because they had this reputation. Not the whole Austrian people, but nonetheless, anti-Semitism was not now a barely perceptible phenomenon in Austrian society. But that's not all. When you look on the map now, Austria has a common frontier with Czechoslovakia, a frontier of more than 200 kilometers. So what did this mean? Göring, when the German army occupied Austria, Göring had called Prague, the Czech president, to tell him that the Czechs had nothing to fear out of this annexation. But in reality, the Czechs had, the same as the French, in the frontiers they had with Germany before the annexation, and particularly in the area where German-speaking people lived, the Sudeten, the Czechs had fortified this northern and northwestern frontier, so that the Germans could not easily invade Czechoslovakia from that angle. But now that Austria became a German province, this meant that in strategical terms, in military terms, the position of Czechoslovakia in case of a German invasion was hopeless. The southern frontier was wide open to a German attack. So in other words, Czechoslovakia became now much more vulnerable in case of a German military intervention than before. It was without credible defense by its own. And the Czech army was one of the best in terms of military equipment, in terms also of, let's say, readiness. But nonetheless, strategically, they were in a hopeless situation. But that was not all. Austria has had and still has a common frontier with Hungary and with Yugoslavia. So Germany now became neighbor to Hungary and to Yugoslavia. So in other words, this was for Hitler very important. because the Germans, the Nazis needed for their war efforts to import a number of rare metals which were found in Hungary and in Yugoslavia. So in other words, this was a boost for the German war industry. They could now more easily and directly get these supplies. And last not least, the two countries, Hungary and Yugoslavia, will have now for the next years closer political relations with Nazi Germany. In the two countries, dictatorial governments were at the head of the countries. In Hungary, it was an admiral who was a dictator. Now you could ask, well, what does an admiral do in Hungary, which was continental bound? There was, of course, no access to an open sea after World War I. But before World War I, when Hungary was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was a navy. Austria had a navy located in the ports of Trieste. So in other words, this Hungarian admiral dated from earlier dates. Afterwards, his name is Horthy, Horthy, Horthy. He was a military dictator, and he now, of course, he was friendly with Hitler because he was a dictator, and Hitler, after all, was also one. In Yugoslavia, there was also a dictatorial government. In Yugoslavia, it was a king. The king practically, the man who was, the one who was king at that time, practically ruled like a dictator. So in other words, Hitler did also take advantage politically, economically and politically of this common frontier he had with these two countries. So in other words, Hitler had every reason to be satisfied. He got by with this annexation. And of course, he had the very great personal satisfaction that he, Hitler, brought his home country into a greater Germany. That was for him personally, of course, also an intimate satisfaction. Now, so far for this annexation of Austria, do you have a question?
Did Hitler ever carry out the referendum that he talked about?
He organized the referendum. In Germany, 99% or if not more were in favor of this annexation. In Austria, there was also a huge majority in favor of this annexation. Now, there is no doubt that in Austria, and it would be an exaggeration and a mistake to call the Austrians that they were crypto-Nazis all the time. But the fact is that Austria was a country which was created, the small country which it became and which it still is, was a creation after World War I, and that they had the greatest difficulties as a country to survive, financially and economically. You must imagine the capital city of this country, which had a population of 6.5 million, Vienna, had more than 2 million inhabitants. In other words, a third of the country lived in the capital. It was an overinflated head. And so it took a long time before it was viable. It had to get support from Mussolini. Even the French supported it. So in other words, many Austrians believed that they could not survive alone, that they would have to join Germany, that it was a matter of survival, and at the same time to ensure their standards of living. So there is no doubt that that there was a great sympathy for this annexation, not necessarily for the Nazis as such, but for joining Germany. Later on, of course, they will be accused of having been friendly and so on, but I think that is pushing a little bit the argument. Do you have another question? No other question. Okay. I will announce the colors now. The second target was Czechoslovakia. And as Hitler had left no doubt that he wanted the destruction of Czechoslovakia, He did not want to. He just wanted Czechoslovakia to be destroyed. So, in other words, here the action was certainly much more dangerous because in Czechoslovakia there was a German minority, 3.5 million Germans, German-speaking people lived in the Sudeten area. The other 5 million were Czechs and the other 3 million were Slovaks, and there was 1.5 million Ruthenians who lived in the easternmost area, which the Ruthenians were cousins of the Ukrainians. So in other words, Czechoslovakia was a multinational state. There were also Hungarians living there. So in other words, it was a very complex state, but the majority of the population certainly did not want to join Germany. There was no doubt about it. There was just a small minority. And therefore, Hitler was not able to carry out his plan, the destruction of Czechoslovakia, in one move, as he did for Austria, without major complications. And that is why he achieved this in 2 rounds. The first round ended up with the Munich Conference, September 28th, 29th, 1938. And the second round will come only in 1939, on the 15th of March, the occupation of Prague and what was left of Czechoslovakia, at least the Czech part. Next time we will concentrate on the first round, Munich.